Hey, what's up? It's Jason Wojo. Welcome to the Life Inner Show. On the Life Inner Show, we help people make more, work less, and create lives and businesses they love. I am joined by my Polish co-host, Peter. What's up, bro?
Polish co-host, Peter.
I didn't want to say Polish, man. Peter. You know how it is. I didn't want to be redundant.
I know. It's like you're trying to put me in the box. No, it's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen. No. Not going to happen.
No. It's interesting because we are talking on this particular episode about boxes, right? And putting people in the boxes and all that stuff. And that was one thing that I really got out of this episode that was pretty impactful. So go ahead, share with people what are we talking about today.
Yeah, so we got Steve Adams on the line. He's the author of a book called Sacred Intersections, which is it's a very, very short book. It was recommended to me, and you'll hear the story of how it came to be by one of my friends. And this is a guy who, the message I want you to hear from this podcast episode is one that and I don't say this lightly, it will transform the way you live your life if you take to heart what he's talking about. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's an incredibly, incredibly powerful, life-changing message, but it's also very simple. Yes. And so like, I'm really excited for all of our listeners to find this out. If you're not already doing this, my guess is maybe you've had some thoughts about this, but you've never really heard it said this way. And it's gonna make a huge difference.
Yeah, it's a very impactful book, and there is not that many books out there in the world that can make an impact on your life as this one does.
Yeah.
So Sacred Intersections, Steve Adams.
Let's do it right now. Here's the interview. Steve Adams, welcome to Life Inner Show. Thank you so much for being our guest.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Steve, before we started recording, you mentioned this, and I had no idea that we actually have mutual friends here. Like, I'm actually, kind of honored, and I feel like kind of special that we know someone that you know. And we're talking about, and actually JP was a podcast guest of ours already, so our audience may be familiar with JP. And so I'll tell you, a couple of years ago, we're in New Orleans, and we had one of our mastermind retreats, which is part of Life in Air. And I'm sitting there with JP, and he pulls out this book because the topic that someone was discussing in that moment was relevant completely to your book. And he's like, "You guys need to get this book." And it was a little book, and I was super inquisitive, and I'm like curious what that is. And he's like, it's called Sacred Intersections, and it's by Steve Adams. You have to pick it up. It's a quick read, but it will just leave you a changed person. And I took that, and I wrote it down, and I went home and ordered the book. And when it came in the mail, I blasted through it, and you should see my copy. It's highlighted, underlined, arrows, asterisks, and it's a short book, but it is, Steve, if everybody did what you talk about in that book, like how different would the world would be? And I don't want to give away, how would you summarize? I have a summary, and I'm curious as to how it compares with what you think the book is about and how you would capture it, probably a lot better than I would. But tell people what that book is about in a nutshell.
The genesis of it was, I worked for many years in a nonprofit agency doing international work, and it's a faith-based organization. And I found myself frustrated with the way that we were framing conversations, the way we were framing reality, and recognizing that there was a lot of faith-based jargon being used, and a lot of concepts being thrown around that portrayed, for me, the essence of what faith, in my mind, is actually about, was being framed in ways that were exclusive and telling the information in ways that it made it sound like, we're in and you're out, and we're right and you're wrong. And there's this constant categorizing and labeling of things that I just felt was really destructive. And, we write these books trying to convince them that we're right and they're wrong. And all it does is push people further away from what it is that's actually at the heart of what you're trying to talk about. And so when I wrote this book, I was trying to capture what's actually working well for us in our organization and in my own life. How would I actually frame the things that are working well for me and transforming me, how can I frame those in ways that sort of neutralize the conversation down to the essence of that, rather than trying to convince somebody that my window on the world is the only window on the world. So I kind of wrote the book as an everyman book. Wrote it to an everyman audience, saying, look, these are some things I've discovered that seem to work really well for me, and they seem to work really well for a whole lot of other people. And so maybe you ought to consider some of these things and think about how they might fit in with your window on the world. A more invitational kind of an approach, if you will. Mm-hmm. And so I sat down to write it in that way. Now, the funny part is when you write a book for every man, you're also writing it for nobody, because you don't have any defined audience, and it really makes it very difficult to get it out there, right? But I still am committed to that construct of saying, look, this is stuff that anybody can apply in their life and make discoveries about how they want to live their life and how they want to experience the fullness of life. So for me, it's a book about living into a way of being that is more rewarding, more fulfilling, more satisfying.
Right. Well,
it's not a book about belief systems. It's a book about a way of being.
Yeah. And, I'm not sure if you would describe it this way, but for me, the book, even the term sacred intersections, essentially you kind of unpacked that and said, think of all the innumerable millions or billions or trillions of exact decisions, choices, circumstances, conditions that had to align perfectly for you and that person, whether it's a person walking by you in a store or at the checkout counter, or the person that's holding the door for you in line, and like all of the things that had to coordinate perfectly. What are the chances of that happening? Like let's run the math on that. And the chances of those things happening is like, it's beyond like probability. I mean, we could probably have a better chance of winning the lottery 10 times in a row than these things all aligning perfectly. Yeah. And so in the book, you kind of talk about like, so if we agree that the chances of this happening is beyond worldly math, there's a reason why that person, why that instance, why that thing is happening right then and there. What are you doing about it? Like why is that happening?
Yeah. I think of it slightly differently than that. Yes, okay. To me, there's this amazing mystery that happens. Who could have said a month ago that the three of us would be sitting here right now? We couldn't, right? Life is unpredictable, right? And so the beauty of it for me is that mystery. So rather than looking for serendipity, what I'm looking for is something that triggers my awareness that these moments, anytime my story intersects with another person, mm-hmm. that's sacred ground, because I think where God lives is in relationships. And so when my story intersects with your story, that's where I sense the divine. That's where I sense love. And for me, that's the essence of the divine. And so when I think about, and sometimes really serendipitous things happen, right? But for me, that's not the goal. The goal is for me to experience God in my everyday interactions, in my everyday living. Mm-hmm. Because when I'm aware of God, it becomes sacred.
Mm-hmm. Got it.
And I become aware of God because it is sacred. There's a dance there. Does that make sense?
Yep.
And so I'm not looking for serendipity. I'm not trying to say that everything is predetermined and that kind of a construct of God is in control. To me, that's not indicative of love. Love doesn't control. Love invites. Coercion controls. Manipulation controls. Love only invites. I can't force you to love me. I can only invite you to love me. So now I'm out of control. And that's mysterious and beautiful and powerful. And it makes me want to get up in the morning because I don't know what I'm going to experience.
Yeah, that is, I see, I knew you were going to say it better than I could. And so,
Well,
so
that's why it's coming from an author.
I know, right? That's why, that's why you wrote the book. So that is fascinating to me. And also one of the other points you talk about in the book is how often we kind of let those moments go by and we don't recognize them. They just pass and then they're gone like in a flash. And so being more aware of those moments.
Present. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Yep.
Being aware, living in the moment, because that's where you experience the beauty of life.
Right.
You know, there's a lot about life that's mysterious. and we don't have a lot of control over most things. I have a little bit of control over my own choices. Don't have much control over yours. So let's live with that. And what it does is it triggers the enjoyment. The subtitle of the book is Enjoying and Enhancing the Stories Around Us. So if I can slow down enough to enjoy you and your story, that's beautiful. And if I get an opportunity to somehow make your story a little better story, even just by listening well, then that's beautiful. That's powerful. It's transformative. It's divine, sacred.
Mm-hmm. So it's
a call to living in the moment and experiencing life that way. It's a much more full and rich way to live.
100%. Talk a little bit more about the story and what normally we do with people, other people's story. What do we kind of tend to do oftentimes?
Yeah, for me, what happens is, let's go back to what you were talking about. I'm in an auditorium before a movie, or I'm walking down the street in a crowded area, and I notice a person. Well, what happens is I look them up and down, and I start to try to figure out who they are and what they're like, and I have all kinds of triggers that tell me things about what they are by the clothes they're wearing and the way they're walking and their size and their shape and their what they look like, and all of these things that trigger things in my mind that make me think that I actually know something of their story. And I know nothing of their story. And I may, in fact, actually start to put them into some little, categories of my own making in that instant, and sort of walk a slightly different direction to avoid them, because I've made it up in my mind that that's a person I should avoid when I know nothing of who they are. And so our brains are wired to do these. The neural pathways are built for us to categorize people that way and label them. And part of what I'm trying to invite people into is you don't have to do that, actually. The only reason it's wired into your brain that way is because you've been doing it all your life. But you can intentionally stop doing it.
Right.
So instead of walking down the street and thinking I'm trying to figure out everybody on the street, what I'm trying to trigger instead of categories is curiosity.
All right.
I wonder what that person's, what brought that person to be here today? What a fascinating thing. Here we are on the same street at the same time. I wonder how they got here. I wonder what their life has been like. I wonder where they grew up. I wonder. And suddenly you start saying, I wonder a few times, and that person that's coming toward you is no longer an object of your own making. They're a person.
Yeah. I love that, because, one of the things that you were talking, what pops into my mind is like, when you were 5 years old, you didn't go and put people in categories, I don't think, right? And you had this wonder, right? Look at a kid. One of the most frequent questions you hear from a kid is what? Why? Why? They're always wondering, right? Why?
They're curious.
Why? Right?
Yeah. Because I said so.
Yeah. And I think that's when it starts to diminish that, right? Yeah. That said so, it starts to diminish that wonder.
For sure.
Well,
and part of it is just, in a sense, part of our survival mechanisms that we inherit, right? It's a way to protect ourselves. It's we all have patterns that we use to keep ourselves safe and to keep ourselves from feeling like somebody doesn't like us, and to keep ourselves in a place where we feel more in control. All of those things are really natural. I'm not trying to heap guilt or shame on people with that. I'm just trying to point it out so that you can make different choices, because nobody's holding a gun to your head saying, put that person in a category.
Mm-hmm.
We're choosing to do it. And we can choose otherwise. But it takes time. It's reforming new habits. It's not simple. One of the things about my book, I think that I've kind of been working on since writing the book, is thinking about how do you take these ideas and actually put them into practice. Because I don't do a lot of that in the book. I talk a good bit more just about kind of what and a little of the why, but not quite so much about the how. There's some of that in there, but I'm just really trying to open people's minds to this different way of imagining things, so that they can try some stuff that might really transform the way they think about themselves.
Well, I love what you said there. Yeah. I mean, instead of categorizing, adopt an attitude of curiosity. And I think what you said is totally right. And Peter, what you said is right as well. Like, we kind of learn to just broadly paint broad strokes with people based on oftentimes their appearance or even the way they talk, or, whatever it is, whatever outward characteristic or trait that we tend to latch onto. And I think it's subconscious to some level. And I also think there's something there, Steve, that sometimes we do this to make ourselves feel better. Like you know what I mean? Like, there's some insecurity we have in ourselves, and we choose to judge people. And so could you talk about that a little bit? How do we get past that? Certainly there's awareness, like, hey, I should be more curious, but how do people actually do it? Like, what are some good things to remember or to do?
Yeah, it's really interesting how you phrase that, because part of the answer is in the way you actually ask that question. I think you're so spot on.
He's a little slow, so I mean.
Yeah, no. I'm not saying this in a negative way. I'm saying it in
I'm busting his chops.
Yeah.
I get it.
No,
I know.
But you used the word should.
Mm-hmm.
I should be more this way, and a lot of us live our lives that way rather than saying, I get to live this way. What a privilege.
Mm-hmm.
And it flips it. Because what I'm talking about is joyous. It's beautiful. It's powerful. It's wondrous, right? Every day can be a wondrous stroll. And no matter, even when you're under pressure at work, and if you take that moment to pause and reflect and go, wait a minute, I'm getting to be about some good stuff here. We're actually busy at our office. That's good, and practice some gratitude. It flips things back around. Gratitude is so powerful. And so when we go at it with gratitude rather than obligation, it flips it. It becomes life-giving instead of life-sucking. Obligation is life-sucking.
Yeah.
It pulls life from us. And none of us ever lives up to our sense of obligations. We don't. We can't. We're not up to it. And we've got to get better at giving ourselves grace.
Right. Listen, what I just heard you. Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I said what I heard you say when you're talking about what you said, framing the question from should to get. There needs to be that acceptance that happens, right, for yourself. Right? Can you talk about that? Because I think for some people, it's hard to actually accept that. They keep saying, I should do that. Should, right? Accepting that part.
Yeah. And probably more than anything else that drove me to write the book, and what has driven me since, is best encapsulated by a simple question that I wrote into the book. And I think it's by far the most profound thing that has ever come off of my pen or out of my lips. And it's a very simple thing. The question is, what if we lived, and when I say we, I mean all of humanity, but also each one of us individually. What if we lived as if God actually loves us? Think about that for a minute. What if we lived as if God actually does really love us? Now, in certain faith traditions, talk about God being a God of love. But the reality is, as soon as we get into those systems, somehow the God of love turns into a God of obligation. and a God of expectations, and a God with folded arms tapping his foot saying, you're not doing enough for me lately. Or a God with a pointing finger saying, you messed up again, you idiot. Instead of a God who every morning when you wake up is sitting there going, hey, I'm here again. Let's spend the day together, shall we? It's a whole different way of being. And unfortunately, I think whether a person is even believes in the divine or not, I think most people on the planet will arrive at some point or other as they mature with the idea that love is the only thing that's worth living for. It always comes down to love, doesn't it? Have you ever met somebody who says, I got too much love in my life, I don't want any more love?
Right.
Right? Why do we all want love? Well, because I think that's because it's the nature of God.
Right.
And so what if we live as if that is the nature of God? And I'm not asking people to even really truly even believe in God to get there. But what if you imagined that there was a divine being whose essence was love, and that the whole story we're in is a story of unfolding love? Now I've got something I can live into, because love doesn't put expectations on me. It just invites me. You know, we tend to make God into somebody who's trying to get rid of things in our lives, get rid of the worst of us, instead of inviting us into being the best of us.
Well, you know, and
a question going there.
As you're talking, Steve, I'm thinking of like, well, when you make this realization and you recognize that, it seems like a natural outflowing or reflection of that love would simply come through you. Like you're just, because you yourself,
that's right.
And that's really the key, right? Because it's not.
You can't give away what you don't have.
Yeah.
And at our core, it's pretty easy for me to imagine that God loves my wife, or loves you guys, or loves anybody else. That's not too hard for me to imagine, because I might love that person, right? And be willing to. But for God to love me, that's a whole different story. I know too much about me.
Right.
How could God ever love me?
We all know too much about ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. And so we play this game and we turn God into something that's demanding of us and expecting, you know, and instead of, there's a story in the Bible that's referred to as the prodigal son. But I love the picture of the father in that story. The son's gone off and, you know, blown it all over the place, took his inheritance and squanders it. And he decides, you know what, I'm just going to go back home, and life's got to be better there. And maybe my father will let me back. So he goes back. But the picture of the father there isn't standing on the porch with the finger pointing. It's the open arms running toward him saying, I love you so much. I'm so glad you're back. Why'd you go away in the first place? Right? It's a different image. And we need to allow ourselves to receive that from the divine. And even if you want to depersonalize it, it changes your life when you actually imagine that you are loved in some way by the cosmos. I personalize it. I think there is a personal dimension to this, and it's more powerful when it is. But I can have this conversation with somebody who's an atheist as well. It doesn't require me to predefine what the nature of God is, other than to say, let's just imagine if it was love, what would my life be like, and how could it be different? And what if we all actually imagined it that way? Would it change things? And I believe it absolutely would. Because if God is for me, I can kind of let my shoulders drop a little bit and go, oh yeah, I don't have to prove anything to anybody, do I? Now I got myself off my hands so that I can give my attention to somebody else. Because if I'm thinking about how I'm performing, how I'm holding up, how I'm obeying, how I'm doing, if I'm all the time thinking about if I'm measuring up, then where are my eyes all the time? They're on me. The only way to get your eyes off of you and actually experience real life is to get your eyes off of you and onto another, and practice curiosity and listening and caring and being for that other person in such a way that love emerges.
That makes
Does that make sense?
Makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. And, you know, you have a really eloquent yet simple way to talk about these things that I think people are really resonating with. Is this also an essential part of what you're doing now with the living forward stuff?
Yeah. I'm integrating some of my living forward spiel into this conversation as we go. I started this organization called Living Forward, and I capitalized the F and the O and the R, living forward. And the play there is about what I was just describing, being for other people, defining ourselves by what we're for much more than by what we're against. And most religious institutions end up sounding, at least, like they're defining themselves by what they're against, right? And the way we practice and the way we hold ourselves to a standard, we're calling ourselves to define ourselves by what we're against, because we're sitting there trying to figure out, why did I do that again? You idiot, right? Self-talk becomes very negative when our self-talk can, when we simply go, wait a minute, oh yeah, I'm loved. And if you can't imagine directly the idea that somehow God, if they exist, I prefer to use the ungendered pronoun these days for God, because obviously God isn't gendered. The English language just forces us to put a gender on it. But in any case.
Well, let me ask you a question then, because one of the things you're talking about, God of love and things like that, right? And I truly believe that. But I wonder if you have people coming up to you because you've wrote the book and asking you the question like, well, how would I know that this is actually the case, that God loves me? And who am I for him to love me?
Well, exactly. That's right. That's where I was. That's where I was yes, very good question. And it's the essence of the whole practice, I think, because it just comes down to our own imagination. So I can sit and wonder about it and kind of go, I don't have any actual proof of anything, but I can imagine it. And one of the things that helps me to imagine it, this is where I was trying to go a minute ago, is if I imagine a person who loves me. You know, there are certain people in most of our lives, not everybody, but most of us have one or two people who, whenever you see them, all that you see in their eyes is that they love you and care for you and care about you. And so I picture that person's face and go, that person right now is representing the divine to me. And it lets me, just experience that sense of, yes, I am loved. I am lovable. I'm not perfect. I'm not that, but I can be lovable, and I can give myself enough grace to stop worrying about whether I'm measuring up and choose to walk in the idea that I'm already loved. That I'm choosing to walk in the imagination. If you want to call it a belief, you can, but I'm choosing to live in a belief that the nature of the essence of life revolves around love and relationship. Therefore, if I can't receive love, how am I supposed to give it? So I have to train myself to be able to receive love. And the way I do that is by practicing being for others. That's why I like the construct of sacred intersections so much, because it gets my eyes off of me and onto the other. And suddenly it's like I stop being the dog chasing his own tail. Because when I'm chasing my tail, I'm not getting anywhere. If I get my eyes off of the tail and onto the other person, something deep in my soul changes when I am for another person. And that's when I start to experience the divine, which then makes me think, okay, there must be something to this imagination, because when I do it, it changes me in a good way. And so instead of trying to prove it, scientifically with a test tube, I say, try it. See if it doesn't actually change the way you experience your day. And if it does, then maybe that's reflective of a deeper reality.
Right. And I think it also aligns with what you said earlier. This question aligns with what you said earlier about love and expectation. I think the person who's questioning whether God loves him, there's some kind of an expectation there, right? And when love, there is no expectation. If you just go with that, all of a sudden you start seeing life in a completely different way. You start seeing those sacred intersections and things like that, right?
Yep. Yeah. When you have these kinds of conversations that dance in and out of faith, this is where I was trying to avoid making too many assumptions when I wrote the book, because not everybody has the same experience of religious belief in their life or spirituality in their life. And so I'm trying to invite people to just, I like using words like imagination. Just imagine it and try it and see if it works. And if it does, then maybe there's a way to rethink. And so when I look at my background came out of a church background, and so those are the experiences that led me to how I think about things. But it's not the only way to think about things. But when I do, I can say, and in America, you can still sort of talk about faith in ways that you can have, a certain level of agreement around some assumptions that people sort of know what it is you're at least referring to. The point I want to make is when I look at things that Jesus said and how he lived, when you start to imagine this, what if we lived as if God actually loves us? And you start to rethink about how you read those stories about Jesus. And you suddenly realize that he's doing something very different than what most of us have been taught. Mm-hmm. He's trying to get us to reimagine the divine constantly, instead of heaping more platitudes on us and more principles that we should live by. I don't think that's what he was about. I think he was about flipping the whole thing on its head and saying, you guys, you got the nature of God all wrong. Wake up. If you've seen me, you've seen what God is like. And what am I like? I love you.
So how does that... So Steve, let me just, I want to kind of pivot here a little bit to talk about living forward. And, on the website, it's just livingforward.us. You talk about things, I think, that like in today's culture are really, they're very polarizing for some people. Like we live in a culture where, everybody seems to be in arms about, you don't agree with me, you hate me, you think this. Everybody has pointing fingers and everybody's just so much discontent. Where does living forward fit into that? How does that address today's challenges where like there is so much apparent division and bringing us back to unity?
Yeah, it's really a crazy season. But I think the way I'm looking at it is I'm holding on to hope. That all of this division, all of this craziness, all of this combativeness is just some birth pangs. That some new stuff is going to emerge out of this. I have to hold on to that hope or I can't get up in the morning. And so it's fun. You described my website as livingforward.us. .org wasn't available. And so I chose the .us, but actually I like saying it us, livingforward.us.
Yeah, I like that.
That part of the game we're in is we have to begin to think in terms of a bigger us. Mm-hmm. Bear with me for a minute. Think about this. If I can come to the point where I'm thinking that I'm in an us with me and the divine, now I can be in an us with me and the divine and my wife, Linda, and my kids. And so now we're an us in our family. And how do we live this sort of life of sacred intersections with each other? How do I wake up in the morning and before I roll out of bed, just kind of glance in my wife's direction and think, she's still here. She didn't leave yesterday. Yahoo! Another day, right? And now I'm ready to get out of the bed and go into my day. And if we do that with the divine, that same sense of we're in these relationships, they're a gift, walk in them. So the us becomes, who am I in relationship with? And then you start to bridge out. I like the metaphor of fractals. Do you know what a fractal is? A fractal is a pattern that when you see a pattern on a paper and then you zoom in on one piece of the pattern, it's the same pattern again. And then you zoom in on one piece of that pattern and it's the same pattern again. You may have seen this, art that's formed that way, that you just go down in and in and in and in. So I like to think of the smallest fractal being the core relationship with the divine, my own sense of identity. And if the divine is love, then I'm going to live in that. That's where I'm going to imagine. That's my starting point. And so then I take that into my next wave of relationships, and then maybe we can make an us. And then we start to think of that way. But instead of us being an us that's exclusive, we become an us that is also displaying the same pattern. That's getting how I said, get my eyes off of myself. How does a group get their eyes off of themselves? They go serve somebody else and they make a difference in the community. And so now they're reflecting that same pattern, but on a bigger scale. And now those groups of people can do the same. And the goal here is to keep making a bigger and bigger us, so that we're not excluding, we're actually including. Because think about this for a minute. If we live as if God actually loves us, I would find it hard to imagine anybody that would actually say that if God is love, God loves everybody, right? Everybody. And so when we start making the us bigger and bigger, what we're doing is we're moving closer and closer to the way that God views things. So we've got our nice little comfortable divisions on a local level and then a regional level, and our subcultures and cultures and subcultures, and everybody's against everybody else. But instead, we can flip that around to being for each other. Now we move it up to a grander level. Are there actually lines that define where our nations are on the planet? There aren't. We've created those borders. That's our own doing. Our nations are all what we've defined them to be, and now we define ourselves around that nation. But I could be wrong, but I think that when God looks at Earth, he doesn't see those borders. He sees the Earth. He sees all of humanity, and he can see all of us instantly at once, individually and collectively. And so when we start to think about us as everybody, that we're all for each other, only then do we get to the point where we're actually starting to traffic in what it is that God has us here for. I don't know if that's making sense, but there's that sense of that fractaling thing. I think is really helpful when we can sort of imagine that our goal ought to be living for each other. Let's imagine a future that's more in line with what the prophets of old have always called us to. There will be no more war. There will be no more tears. There will be no more on the other side, that kind of thinking. But I think the call is to live that way more and more now. We like to think of it as after we die or after some other, cataclysmic event or something. But what if we live that way now? We can choose to be that way now.
And in the moment.
How we choose. It's all how we choose.
Right.
But the problem is that we're taught that the only way to get there is going top down. And it doesn't work if you try to go top down, because now it's not love and you're not reflecting the same pattern. It's power. It's institutional power. And so that doesn't change people.
Right.
What changes people is when we recognize that we're loved and we can love others, and we do it. And then we can it just spills, it grows up.
It's just, I picture that pebble dropping in the pond at that point, right? And it's affecting the community to the globe. I mean, eventually. How to, Steve, so tell people, like, I have no doubt people are resonating with this right now. They want to learn more about you, what you're doing, you know, how to get involved, like how they can start to live this way. Like what are some of the resources you direct people to?
Yeah. So obviously that little book, I think, still has a lot to say for people. And I would write it a little differently now if I wrote it, but you know, I wrote it, I guess 8 or 9 years ago now. Right. And I have had not so much people walking up to me on the street because I'm not that recognizable. You know, I'm not out on the 6 o'clock news and people know my face, but I do have people that when they find out who I am and talk, they go, your book changed my life. And I'm like, golly, you know, it's so humbling and so, you know, beautiful to have that happen. And so I think the book has value. But what I'm doing with Living Forward, the organization, the nonprofit that I've formed since, is inviting people into practicing some things that help you to live this way. And so I do a course that's called a stepping in course. The idea is stepping into this story. What's the bigger story, this grander story that takes us to this bigger picture of what could life be if we all started to live as if God actually loves us? How do you get there? And there are some things that you can practice, some habits, if you will. I don't love that word, but they're practices that I think if people integrate them into their life, they can help you to live this way of being more attentive, living more in the moment, slowing down. I call it in the intersections. There's a chapter in the book about slowing down and living more in the moment, learning how to be for people. There are things that we can do to train ourselves to get that way. And so we offer this course that's an 8-week course. And in the course of those 8 weeks, they're done it's very much like what we're doing right now. We typically do it on a Zoom call. We've been doing the courses for a few years now and using Zoom when it was kind of a novelty. And now it's kind of like an anchor right around our necks, because who wants another Zoom call in their week, right? But hopefully people are just sort of getting now to the point where they go, you know what, Zoom's here to stay, or other video, you know, any video content contexts of relationship are here to stay. So just get used to it and go with it. So in this context, we limit the conversation to 3 to 5 people. And so what happens is over a course of 8 weeks, you all get to know each other's story a little bit. And the conversation revolves around a little bit of content that we introduce every week that says, here's a new thing to add to these practices. Now add that and try it. Let's get together again next week and share our stories about how this played out. How did it impact your life, if at all? And so the main driver of the course is actually people telling their stories, and which is really powerful. And over the course of those 8 weeks, we developed this whole set of, I call them 4 rhythms for living forward rather than 4 habits. I like the word rhythm. They're rhythms that we can practice in our lives that help us to live like I'm describing, in terms of being for others and experiencing the joy that comes with that and the meaning that comes with that. And sometimes the pain that comes with that. It's all of life. You know, our stories are complicated, but in that, you know, the suffering leads to deeper understanding of other things. So, you know, it's not pie in the sky, you know, kind of a life that I'm talking about here. It's real life, but it's rich, it's full, or at least more so.
And I see it on your website now. It says this is stepping into the story course right on your website.
Yeah, that's right.
So that's it. Yep. Okay.
And there's an inquiry place that they can go to the website and they can click on a thing that says, I want more information about that. Let me know when the next course is happening. Because we do them, you know, as people want to do it, we'll create a new section and do it.
Yeah, and again,
and also there's a link to the publisher of the book. The publisher of the book is called 356 Press. We have a website for that as well. That's separate from the Living Forward nonprofit. So they can go to 356 Press and just use the numbers 3, 5, and 6
Okay.
plus press.com to get the book in a print form, or you can get the book on Amazon or Nook or Apple iBooks. Its ebook form is available as well.
Got it.
So,
well, Steve, so that is, so you have a lot here. So livingforward.us, I love it. And I mean, this is a message, man, that I think, I mean, it really is changes everything. And so I want to just, acknowledge you for putting this together, and whether, you feel like you were a conduit and this was just poured out of you, or you came up to it. In any case, this has been amazing. And I'm very honored and privileged to have you on the show. And I think our listeners are going to be changed as a result of this. And hopefully you'll be hearing from some of them as they inquire and to learn more and work with you.
Yeah, thanks so much. You're right. It was one of these things where, that's another whole conversation, but how the book came about in terms of writing it was quite a ride. Every time I started a new section, it was like, oh, it was just amazing how it kind of flowed out. It was really, really enjoyable. I hadn't ever written anything quite like this before, so it was a joy. And I'm really glad that it's having an impact on some people's lives, and glad it touched your heart. That's why you wrote me in the first place. And that's what I want it to be about. Let's learn to be for each other and enjoy each other, and invite each other to slow down and listen. This combative thing that we're facing isn't doing us any good. Let's learn to slow down and really listen.
Yep, I'm with you.
And remember that we're all in this together. Let's make a bigger us.
I'm with you. Steve, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's been a joy.
Man, I love that book. I loved talking with Steve, and what I loved that he said is it's all about, first you got to be able to receive love before you can give love. That's a one huge lesson that I got from it. And how many people do we know when they don't feel loved, that shows in every way. Right. And you're not going to be able to kind of love on other people. You're not going to have an appreciation for other people's stories. You're not going to look at people for the, as someone that you can come alongside and make their day better. And I love the fact that he kind of talked about, where does that love come from? And so it's more like, in some cases we're vessels of love for other people. And I don't know, that was a powerful lesson for me. And also where he said the most important thing of everything is just love, really. That's it, right? That's the only thing worth living for is love.
Yeah. And it's, what people do say that, right? A lot of times they do say about love and how important it is. But I think this episode kind of really emphasized why it's important, how it's so important, right? It's not so kind of fluffy kind of a thing. It's something that really is important, right? It's something that really actually works when you come from that place. And the lessons that I've gotten out of this is the fact about, love, no expectancy, expectations, right? 2, being in the present moment, just be. That's a very powerful concept. Slowing down, he talked about that a little bit, and he mentions that in the book. And when you start incorporating those things, I think you start to actually live life and notice the world in a completely different way. And I would even say that living a way that was meant to be. Yeah. Seeing the world that it actually exists, right?
Well, and but the thing is too, is and I love what he said, imagine what it would be like, or if you accepted that God actually loved you. And now I'm paraphrasing, he didn't say it that way. But if we each actually love other people, and you look at people for their story, their uniqueness, instead of making, because how many times do we just make a snap judgment on somebody? You see somebody walking down the road in a moment, you made a judgment on what kind of person that guy is or that girl is, right? They're this, they're that, or we make these snap judgments on, you're a Republican, you're a Democrat, you're black, you're white, you're Hispanic, you're whatever. There's so many different things, but I love what he said. It's it's us. We're all together. And if you love people, I think those boundaries disappear. you don't see somebody against you. You don't see somebody that has, you don't get your guard up. You're not attacking them. You're not judging them, but you just love on them. And yeah, we have our differences, and that's great. That's fantastic. And you look at those differences as maybe even something to be celebrated, but you are instead of focusing on what brings us together. And if we all love each other, then there's no, and listen, I don't know what I'm listening to us talk right now. And some people are thinking like, well, we're getting ready to hold hands and sing Kumbaya. That's not it. Right. This isn't some feel good approach to living. We'll do that later.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
it's a real way. This is a way to just exist. It's a way to be. It's part of who you become. It's part of your identity. And imagine how much different your relationships, your experiences, all of this will be when you just have this curiosity that he talked about, right? Yeah. And this appreciation rather than kind of judgment.
Yeah, I do, man. I agree with you on that because of the fact that if you just come from that place of love, I think you finally are able to actually see the person for who they really are.
Yeah.
We talked about at one point about putting people in the boxes. I mean, looking at you, man, I made 20,000 judgments already. I just
well, dude, in all seriousness,
right?
Yeah. Like in all seriousness, we all get classified and compartmentalized, right?
Yeah. But if you just come from the place of love and you have that, and this is where you're coming from, that's all there is to it. So you can actually see the person for who they really are. And whether it's, your close relationship, think about it. Your kids are aggravating you, right? Or your spouse is aggravating you, or it's someone walking down the street, or it's a stranger or whatever. Every single one of these relationships. Oh, and by the way, the most important relationship in your life, well, besides obviously having a relationship with God, but a relationship with you, yourself. When you start coming from the place of love, when it comes to you, all of a sudden you start seeing yourself in a different way, I think.
Yeah. Right.
That's no totally judgment true. And all that kind of stuff. And you start having some peace in your life.
Yeah, man. There's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of gold in here,
Read the book.
Yeah. Check it out. I mean, it's just, there's so much in there that'll transform the way you feel about yourself, the way you feel about God, the way you feel about others. And listen, even if you're not a believer, like you said, like it doesn't matter. This is still something that we can all kind of embrace, and it'll change the world. It truly will. Like, I mean, it really will. As simple and as difficult as that is at the same time. And so I want to encourage you guys to check out the book, check out what Steve is doing right now, and really take it to heart and see if this makes sense for you. So. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this episode. It was really fun for Peter and I to speak with Steve. And if you love listening to the Life in Your Show, share it with your friends, family, give us a review, give us a rating, let us know how we're doing, let us know how we can serve you more. And if you want to be part of the conversation with other Lifeinaires and be around people that are, all about supporting and encouraging and loving on other people, go on over and download the Lifeinaire app to your iPhone or Android device, or listen or participate on the desktop version. You can go to lifeinaire.com to learn more. Until then, I'd say just love people where you are and realize we get to do this rather than have to. And that, let's just make it about love. That's what it's all about. All right. See you next time, everyone.